From a Survivor was written by Rich 3 years after her husband committed suicide. So they got married when she was 24 in 1953. She married Alfred Conrad, and he was an economist and a social activist, kind of, and a campaigner. And she married him when she was 24. They were married for 17 years, and then they separated after 17 years, and not long after that then Conrad took his own life. The marriage was a difficult one, and much of the difficulty stemmed from her own satisfaction with the whole notion of marriage as it was understood in 1950s America. She wasn't really content to play the role of obedient wife and adoring mother. She was a feminist, and she found this role very difficult to kind of fit into. But as well as that, as their relationship wore on, Rich gradually realised that she was in fact a lesbian, so it made their relationship more difficult as well. And in this poem, which was written 3 years after her husband's death, Rich mourns his passing and reflects on the difficulties of their life. So I'll read through it and we'll go through it bit by bit. I'll split it up into 3 parts. From a Survivor by Adreinne Rich. The pact that we made was the ordinary pact of men and women in those days. I don't know who we thought we were, that our personalities could resist the failures of the race. Lucky or unlucky, we didn't know the race had failures of that order, and that we were going to share them. Like everybody else, we thought of ourselves as special. Your body is as vivid to me as it ever was, even more since my feeling for it is clearer. I know what it could and could not do. It is no longer the body of a god or anything with power over my life. Next year it would have been 20 years, and you are wastefully dead, who might have made the leap we talked too late of making, which I live now. Not as a leap, but a succession of brief, amazing movements, each one making possible the next. Okay, so I'm going to split it into 3 sections. I'm going to go from line 1 to 9, and then from line 10 to 15, or what's that, 17. Okay, so 1 to 9. The pact that we made was the ordinary pact of men and women in those days. I don't know who we thought we were, that our personalities could resist the failures of the race. Lucky or unlucky, we didn't know the race had failures of that order, and that we were going to share them. Like everybody else, we thought of ourselves as special. So in these lines, Rich thinks back to the early days of her marriage, and she focuses especially on the marriage vows between her and her husband, and the pact that they made to be faithful to one another. According to the poet, she and her husband believed that they were special. We thought of ourselves as special, she says. Where is that? Here. We thought of ourselves as special. And they felt that they had the ability to avoid or overcome any difficulties that their long-term relationship might have. They were foolish, they were naive. They were like a lot of young couples, I think, who thought of themselves as different, being able to survive maybe. But in reality, Rich and her husband weren't special at all, and the pact or pledge between them was an ordinary pact. Their marriage was no different to all the men and women in those days, to the thousands of marriages that took place in America each year throughout the 1950s. And like every other couple, they thought they were special enough to be immune to the difficulties, but like every other couple, they were wrong, and they were extremely mistaken. And ultimately then, Rich and her husband would have to deal with tensions and difficulties. And it was kind of naive of them, so very straightforward in the opening here. The pact we made was an ordinary pact of men and women. Everybody did it. It was ordinary. I don't know who we thought we were, that our personalities could resist the failures of the race. There's a bit of shame there, I think. She's a little bit embarrassed about her past, kind of saying we were foolish to jump into this. We were foolish to think that we were invincible in marriage. I don't know who we thought we were, that our personalities could resist the failures of the race. Lucky or unlucky, we didn't know the race had failures of that order, and that we were going to share them like everybody else. We thought of ourselves as special. So it's very straightforward. The young couple, she's only 24 when she marries. I don't know what age Alfred was. But they were a young couple and they thought they were invincible. They thought that they were going to kind of live a happy marriage without any problems, but obviously those kind of things don't exist, and this marriage especially had a lot of problems. In the next section then, I'll read it down from line 9 to line 17. Your body is as vivid to me as it ever was, even more since my feeling for it is clearer. I know what it could and could not do. It is no longer the body of a god or anything with power over my life. So here the poem changes. Up here we have this section where she's talking about them when they got married, or even before they got married, with kind of their thoughts, and they thought they were invincible, they were foolish, they thought of themselves as special. And now she goes to actually talking about her husband, and she's kind of mourning him. Remember, this is not long after his suicide, and it's a bit more pleasant here. We see love in it. Definitely I see love here. And your body is as vivid to me as it ever was. Like, she remembers him exactly as he was, even more since my feeling for it is clearer. So she remembers him more vividly than she did when she was with him. I know what it could and could not do. It is no longer the body of a god or anything with power over my life. So reading this bit, the first few times I read this, I thought maybe no longer the body of a god, that she is telling us that she used to desire her husband, that, you know, she used to love him and love his appearance. But then when you read it a few times, and you know Adreinne Rich like we do at this stage, it's more about that. It's to do with power, I think. What she tells us here, it doesn't have anything, it doesn't have power over her life, but her body, his body used to be the body of a god with power over my life. And it's not religious either, it's just kind of controlling. So these lines highlight some of the difficulties that affected 17 years of Rich's marriage. She found her marriage to be troublesome because in the 50s and 60s a woman was expected to respect and obey her husband and be guided by him in all things. To Rich, as a feminist, this was extremely difficult to take. Society, she felt, regarded her husband as a kind of a god with power over her life. And in the years since her husband's death, Rich's confidence and independence has developed to such an extent that she's no longer worried about being dominated by her husband or any other man. And society changed as well in the time since his death. And there was great political upheaval in America, and women were no longer expected to worship and obey the men that they married. And the changes all allowed Rich to think more clearly about her husband and their marriage. She says, my feeling for it is clearer. Let's see here, changes in America and concept of marriage. Okay, so the changes came about in America and the concept of marriage changed. So her feeling for it is clearer. She's not just referring to his body there and her memory of him. She's referring to her being able to look back at the relationship and see the change in it. She no longer thinks of him as a tyrant with power to control her life, and his body is no longer the body of a god. And she can now set aside the resentment that she felt towards the unequal institution of marriage and focus on the actual love that she had for this man. And her affection for him is suggested by the fact that she can still remember his body perfectly, despite the fact that he's dead. Your body is as vivid to me as it ever was. Okay, and in the last section of the poem then, she tells us basically how long it's been since her husband's death. So he committed suicide about 17 years after they were married, pretty much, and she says next year we would have been 20 years, so they would have celebrated an anniversary. So her husband has been dead 3 years. Next year it would have been 20 years, and you are wastefully dead, who might have made the leap we talked too late of making, which I live now, not as a leap, but a succession of brief, amazing movements, each one making possible the next. So in the last section here, she's mourning her husband's tragic passing. Towards the end of the marriage, it seems that the couple discussed the possibility of divorce. We would have made the leap we talked too late of making, so maybe divorce. And maybe that would have settled things and solved things, and maybe they would have been happy after divorce. but they'll never know now. And she says that her husband wastefully took his life, that he should have waited, he should have taken the leap with her, they should have divorced, and maybe he could be living the life that she's living now. They could have been happy in their separate lives. Rich claims that they had discussed the possibility of making the leap, but it came too late. Before they could fully explore the possibility, he tragically took his own life. Rich shows us here that in the years since her husband's death, she's gone on to lead an extremely happy existence. She says, I live now as a succession of brief, amazing movements. In her new life, according to Rich, each moment is filled with joy and wonder. If her husband had lived, she believes, they could have left their troubled marriage behind and he would have been free to pursue a rich and an independent life as well, as filled with amazing moments of his own. This then is the true tragedy of her husband's death. His passing was an enormous waste because it denied him the opportunity of making the leap from a life dominated by an unhappy marriage into a joyous and independent existence. She says, you're wastefully dead who might have made the leap. So she's happy now. And she's telling him, you wasted it. We could have been happy separately. And that's pretty much it. The fact that the title is From a Survivor. Generally what you hear when somebody passes away, and you might see it on RIP.ie or whatever, they would say survived by his wife, Adrienne, or, you know, that's kind of what it means. So from a survivor, she's survived him. But also, I think that it has a double meaning, this title, and she's saying that she's a survivor, that she went through this terrible time as well, and she managed to live through it, that she didn't maybe wastefully take her own life, as she says that he did. And we'll go through themes now. So one of the first themes that we notice is the theme of survival, obviously, and suicide. So theme, survival and suicide. Like many of her poems, this poem deals with notions of depression and despair. And like the speaker in Living in Sin, the speaker in this poem has suffered incredible mental torment. But the poem, however, is ultimately optimistic, emphasising how important it is to struggle against depression and declaring that a depressed person can recover to live a life filled with amazing moments, like she's doing. It's a powerful statement against suicide, which is presented as a terrible waste. Okay, so suicide is presented as a terrible waste. And she rejoices that she survived and overcame her own suicidal tendencies, while her husband's death is presented as tragic and as a pointless loss. So, theme, survival and suicide. She survived. Her husband's death was tragic and pointless. Husband's death, tragic and pointless. Okay, the next theme is marriage and male dominance, which we see throughout all of her poems. Another recurring theme for Rich. From a Survivor, like many of her poems, presents men as having the ability to dominate and constrain women, especially within the context of a marriage or a long-term relationship. And it's especially evident when she refers to her husband as having the body of a god that has power over her. This notion of women being harassed and dominated by marriage and relationships is one that occurs again and again in Rich's poetry. We see it in Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, we see it in Living in Sin, and in trying to talk with the man. And it's only by breaking free of marriage that she seems to suggest that women can truly be free and realise their own potential. Marriage, she maintains, has the potential to entrap and enslave a woman, submerging her beneath her husband's shadow. But in saying that, it is important to note that it's not entirely negative towards men, this poem, you'll be glad to know. It provides a moving lament for the passing of her husband, and she regrets that he can't be a survivor as well. And like in the poem Trying to Talk with the Man, it mourns the end of the relationship while it acknowledges that the relationship had many positive features. poem leaves us though a little doubt that Rich truly loved her husband. And from a survivor, not only is a political poem attacking the institute of marriage, but it's also a haunting memorial to a relationship that was doomed to failure. So it is haunting, it is sad, but it does show us love that she had for him. Maybe that makes it a bit worse, the fact that it's showing us this love. I don't know. I will leave that up to you to tell me what you think. Her poetic techniques was very conversational language, so we'll put that somewhere along the side. Conversational language. It gives it a sense of immediacy. And it makes it very personal. This is a really personal poem. We can't say the speaker really, we just say Adreinne Rich. We know this is. And the fact that it's so personal, I really admire it. I think it's very, very brave of her to write this. Her enjambment there is very evident. She only really uses colons. She doesn't use any full stops, commas or anything like that. And I think that that's symbolic of her trying to prove a point that you can still go on, like keep going, keep going, keep going. She survived her kind of battle with depression towards the end of her marriage, and she's kind of saying, why didn't you? She's saying you wasted it, you know, you should have battled on as well. So I think maybe the enjambment would work for that as well. If you can think of any other poetic techniques, please let me know. But that's it from a survivor. I really liked it, one of my favourite poems, but it does not make me excited to get married next year. None of her poems actually do. I'm starting to rethink everything. Thanks, Adreinne Rich.